Dark Interlude by Fredric Brown in collaboration with Mack Reynolds. Sheriff Ben Rand's eyes were grave. He said, "Okay, boy, you feel a bit jittery, that's natural. But if your story's straight, don't worry. Don't worry about nothing. Everything'll be all right, boy." "It was 3 hours ago, Sheriff," Allenby said. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get into town and that I had to wake you up. But Sis was hysterical a while. I had to try and quiet her down, and then I had trouble starting the jalopy." "Don't worry about waking me up, boy. Being sheriff's a full-time job. And it ain't late anyway. I just happened to turn in early tonight. Now, let me get a few things straight. You say your name's Lou Allenby. That's a good name in these parts, Allenby. You kin Rance Allenby. Used to run the feed business over in Cooperville. I went to school with Rance. Now, about the fellow who said he'd come from the future." The presider of the Historical Research Department was skeptical to the last. He argued, "I am still of the opinion that the project is not feasible. There are paradoxes involved which present insurmountable—" Dr. Matthe, the noted physicist, interrupted politely. "Undoubtedly, sir, you are familiar with the dichotomy." The presider wasn't, so he remained silent to indicate that he wanted an explanation. Zeno propounded the dichotomy. He was a Greek philosopher of roughly 500 years before the ancient prophet whose birth was used by the primitives to mark the beginning of their calendar. The dichotomy states that it is impossible to cover any given distance. The argument: first, half the distance must be traversed, then half of the remaining distance, and so on. It follows that some portion of the distance to be covered always remains, and therefore motion is impossible. "Not analogous," the presider objected. "In the first place, your Greek assumed that any totality composed of an infinite number of parts must itself be infinite, whereas we know that an infinite number of elements make up a finite total. Besides—" Matthe smiled gently and held up a hand. "Please, sir, do not misunderstand me. I do not deny that today we understand Zeno's paradox, but believe me, for long centuries the best minds the human race could produce could not explain it." The presider said tactfully, "I fail to see your point, Dr. Matthe. Please forgive my inadequacy. What possible connection has this dichotomy of Zeno's with your projected expedition into the past?" "I was merely drawing a parallel, sir. Zeno conceived the paradox, proving that it was impossible to cover any distance, nor were the ancients able to explain it. But did that prevent them from covering distances? Obviously not. Today, my assistants and I have devised a method to send our young friend here, Jan Obreen, into the distant past. The paradox is immediately pointed out. Suppose he should kill an ancestor or otherwise change history. I do not claim to be able to explain how this apparent paradox is overcome in time travel. All I know is that time travel is possible. Undoubtedly, better minds than mine will one day resolve the paradox. But until then, we shall continue to utilize time travel, paradox or not." Jan Obreen had been sitting nervously quiet, listening to his distinguished superiors. Now he cleared his throat and said, "I believe the hour has arrived for the experiment." The presider shrugged his continued disapproval, but dropped the conversation. He let his eyes scan doubtfully the equipment that stood in the corner of the laboratory. Matthe shot a quick glance at the timepiece, then hurriedly gave last-minute instructions to his student. "We've been over all this before, Jan, but to sum it up, you should appear approximately in the middle of the so-called 20th century, exactly where, we don't know. The language will be Ammer English, which you have studied thoroughly. On that count, you should have little difficulty. You will appear in the United States of North America, one of the ancient nations, as they were called, a political division of whose purpose we are not quite sure. One of the designs of your expedition will be to determine why the human race at that time split itself into scores of states rather than having but one government. You will have to adapt yourself to the conditions you find, Jan. Our histories are so vague that we can help you but little in information on what to expect. The presider put in, I am extremely pessimistic about this, Oberyn, yet you have volunteered, and I have no right to interfere. Your most important task is to leave a message that will come down to us. If you are successful, other attempts will be made to still other periods in history. If you fail... He won't fail, Matthe said. The presider shook his head and grasped Oberyn's hand in farewell. Jan Oberyn stepped to the equipment and mounted the small platform. He clutched the metal grips on the instrument panel somewhat desperately, hiding to the best of his ability the shrinking inside himself. The sheriff said, Well, this fella, you say he told you he came from the future. Lou Allenby nodded. About 4,000 years ahead. He said it was the year 3200 and something, but that it was about 4,000 years from now. They'd changed the numbering system meanwhile. And you didn't figure out it was hogwash, boy. From the way you talked, I get the idea that you kind of believed him. The other wet his lips. I kind of believed him, he said doggedly. There was something about him. He was different. I don't mean physically that he couldn't pass for being born now, but there was something different. Kinda, well, like he was at peace with himself. Gave the impression that where he came from, everybody was. And he was smart as a whip, and he wasn't crazy either. And what was he doing back here, boy? The sheriff's voice was gently caustic. He was some kind of student. Seems from what he said that almost everybody in his time was a student. They'd solved all the problems of production and distribution. Nobody had to worry about security. In fact, they didn't seem to worry about any of the things we do now. There was a trace of wistfulness in Lou Allenby's voice. He took a deep breath and went on. He'd come back to do research in our time. They didn't know much about it, it seems. Something had happened in between. There was a bad period of several 100 years, and most books and records have been lost. They had a few, but not many. So they didn't know much about us, and they wanted to fill in what they didn't know. You believed all that, boy. Did he have any proof? It was the dangerous point. This is where the prime risk lay. They had, for all practical purposes, no knowledge of the exact contours of the land 40 centuries back, nor knowledge of the presence of trees or buildings. If he appeared at the wrong spot, it might well mean instant death. Jan Oberyn was fortunate he didn't hit anything. It was, in fact, the other way around. He came out 10 feet in the air over a plowed field. The fall was nasty enough, but the soft earth protected him. One ankle seemed sprained, but not too badly. He came painfully to his feet and looked around. The presence of the field alone was sufficient to tell him that the Matthe process was at least partially successful. He was far before his own age. Agriculture was still a necessary component of human economy, definitely indicating an earlier civilization than his own. Approximately half a mile away was a densely wooded area, not a park, not even a planned forest to house the controlled wildlife of his time. A haphazardly growing wooded area, almost unbelievable. But then he must grow used to the unbelievable. Of all the historic periods, this was the least known. Much would be strange. To his right, a few 100 yards away, was a wooden building. It was undoubtedly a human dwelling, despite its primitive appearance. There was no use putting it off. Contact with his fellow man would have to be made. He limped awkwardly toward his meeting with the 20th century. The girl had evidently not observed his precipitate arrival, but by the time he arrived in the yard of the farmhouse, she had come to the door to greet him. her dress was of another age, for in his era the clothing of the feminine portion of the race was not designed to lure the male. Hers, however, was bright and tasteful with color, and it emphasized the youthful contours of her body. Nor was it her dress alone that startled him. There was a touch of color on her lips that he suddenly realized couldn't have been achieved by nature. He had read that primitive women used colors, paints and pigments of various sorts, upon their faces. Somehow or other, now that he witnessed it, he was not repelled. She smiled, the red of her mouth stressing the even whiteness of her teeth. She said, "It would have been easier to come down the road instead of across the field." Her eyes took him in, and had he been more experienced, he could have read interested approval in them. He said studiedly, "I am afraid that I am not familiar with your agricultural methods. I trust I have not irrevocably damaged the products of your horticultural efforts." Susan Allonby blinked at him. "My," she said softly, a distant hint of laughter in her voice. "Somebody sounds like maybe they swallowed a dictionary." Her eyes widened suddenly as she noticed him favoring his left foot. "Why, you've hurt yourself. Now you come right on into the house and let me see if I can't do something about that. Why—" He followed her quietly, only half hearing her words. Something phenomenal was growing within Jan Oberyn, affecting oddly and yet pleasantly his metabolism. He knew now what Matthe and the presider meant by paradox. The sheriff said, "Well, you were away when he got to your place, however he got there." Lou Allonby nodded. "Yes, that was 10 days ago. I was in Miami taking a couple of weeks of vacation. Sis and I each get away for a week or two every year, but we go at different times, partly because we figure it's a good idea to get away from each other once in a while anyway." "Sure, good idea, boy. But your sis, she believed this story of where he came from?" "Yes, and, Sheriff, she had proof. I wish I'd seen it, too. The field he landed in was fresh plowed. After she'd fixed his ankle, she was curious enough, after what he'd told her, to follow his footsteps through the dirt back to where they'd started. And they ended, or rather started, right smack in the middle of a field, with a deep mark like he'd fallen there." "Maybe he come from an airplane, in a parachute, boy. Did you think of that?" "I thought of that, and so did Sis. She says that if he did, he must have swallowed the parachute. She could follow his steps every bit of the way. It was only a few 100 yards, and there wasn't any place he could have hidden or buried a parachute." The sheriff said, "They got married right away, you say?" 2 days later, I had the car with me, so Sis hitched the team and drove them into town. He didn't know how to drive horses, and they got married." "See the license, boy. You sure they was really—" Lou Allonby looked at him, his lips beginning to go white, and the sheriff said hastily, "All right, boy. I didn't mean it that way. Take it easy, boy." Susan had sent her brother a telegram telling him all about it, but he'd changed hotels, and somehow the telegram hadn't been forwarded. The first he knew of the marriage was when he drove up to the farm almost a week later. He was surprised, naturally, but John O'Brien, Susan had altered the name somewhat, seemed likable enough. Handsome, too, if a bit strange, and he and Susan seemed head over heels in love. Of course, he didn't have any money. They didn't use it in his day, he had told them. But he was a good worker, not at all soft. There was no reason to suppose that he wouldn't make out all right. The three of them planned, tentatively, for Susan and John to stay at the farm until John had learned the ropes somewhat. Then he expected to be able to find some manner in which to make money. He was quite optimistic about his ability in that line, and spending his time traveling, taking Susan with him. Obviously, he'd be able to learn about the present that way. The important thing, the all-embracing thing, was to plan some message to get to Dr. Matthe and the presider. If this type of research was to continue, all depended upon him. He explained to Susan and Lou that it was a one-way trip, that the equipment worked only in one direction, that there was travel to the past, but not to the future. He was a voluntary exile, fated to spend the rest of his life in this era. The idea was that when he'd been in this century long enough to describe it well, he'd write up his report and put it in a box he'd have especially made to last 40 centuries and bury it where it could be dug up, in a spot that had been determined in the future. He had the exact place geographically. He was quite excited when they told him about the time capsules that had been buried elsewhere. He knew that they had never been dug up and planned to make it part of his report so the men of the future could find them. They spent their evenings in long conversations, Jan telling of his age and what he knew of all the long centuries in between, of the long fight upward and man's conquests in the fields of science, medicine, and in human relations, and they telling him of theirs, describing the institutions, the ways of life which he found so unique. Lou hadn't been particularly happy about the precipitate marriage at first, but he found himself warming to Jan until the sheriff said, "And he didn't tell you what he was till this evening." "That's right." "Your sister heard him say it. She'll back you up." I guess she will. She's upset now, like I said, kind of hysterical. Screams that she's going to leave me and the farm, but she heard him say it, Sheriff. He must have had a strong hold on her, or she wouldn't be acting the way she is. "Not that I doubt your word, boy, about a thing like that, but it'd be better if she heard it too. How'd it come up?" "I got to asking him some questions about things in his time, and after a while I asked him how they got along on race problems, and he acted puzzled. And then he said he remembered something about races from history he'd studied, but that there weren't any races then. He'd said that by his time, starting after the war of something or other, I forget its name, all the races had blended into one, that the whites and the yellows had mostly killed one another off, and that Africa had dominated the world for a while, and then all the races had begun to blend into one by colonization and intermarriage, and that by his time the process was complete. I just stared at him and asked him, 'You mean you got blood in you?' And he said, just like it didn't mean anything, at least 1/4. "Well, boy, you did just what you had to do," the sheriff told him earnestly. "No doubt about it." "I just saw red. He'd married Sis. He was sleeping with her. I was so crazy mad, I don't even remember getting my gun." "Well, don't worry about it, boy. You did right." "But I feel like hell about it. He didn't know." "Now that's a matter of opinion, boy. Maybe you swallowed a little too much of this hogwash. Coming from the future, These will think up the damnedest tricks to pass themselves off as white. What kind of proof for his story is that mark on the ground? Hogwash, boy. Ain't nobody coming from the future, or going there neither. We can just quiet this up so it won't never be heard of nowhere. It'll be like it never happened."